Hello, gearheads, and welcome to the Sunday edition of Speed City. I'm Bob Varsha, and you just heard the deep-voiced announcer give you the entire cast of characters on our show normally, but right now we're having a technical issue, and we can't bring you all of those voices. So I'll start off the show. Obviously, we've got a couple of big stories to get to in Formula One, including General Motors getting formal approval for its Formula One team, different elements of the racing community saying they're going to sue the international governing body, the FIA. Lots going on in Formula One and other forms of motorsports. But while we'll deal with our issues, we're going to go back to an interview I did recently with the author of a beautiful new biography of Lewis Hamilton entitled Sir Lewis. The author's name is Michael E. Sawyer. He is an academician from the University of Pittsburgh, where he is a professor of African American literature and culture and director of the English Language Graduate Studies Department there. He is a very good writer. The book is fascinating. It's now arriving on the bookshelves at your favorite store, so check it out. And with that, let's go to my lengthy interview with Michael Sawyer about his book. Now here on the show, it's my honor to welcome author, professor of African American literature and culture, and director of graduate studies in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh, Michael E. Sawyer, who has written a really neat new book on Sir Lewis Hamilton, a biography, and I have lots of questions. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks a lot, Bob. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book.
Okay. I understand from the materials that came with the book that you are a lifelong Formula One fan. Is that true?
Pretty much lifelong, adult lifelong. So I was in the Navy before I joined academia. I was first stationed in Naples, Italy in 1990. So I made it up to the Italian Grand Prix in 1990. So I've been attending Formula One races since, that one. So that was a really eye-opening experience for me.
I noticed that the book took something like 5.5 years to write. I guess what was interesting to me is Lewis is now, with all that he's accomplished, approaching the end of his career. Why write the book now? Why not wait just a few more seasons until he hangs up his helmet?
Yeah, I think a couple of reasons. First off, when we really got to it, it was kind of post the 2021 season. And I think that was really a kind of tipping point for his career. In some ways, I was surprised that I would not have been surprised if he didn't come back after that, after what had happened at Abu Dhabi, frankly. And also, kind of fortuitously, depending upon how you look at it, with the book coming out now, it kind of bookends his long relationship with Mercedes, and then there's, it's kind of this new start. So, with Lewis Hamilton, you may want to wait until, he's 80 when he stops doing it. So there's really no point, because and it was a race against time, really, because it takes a long time to get books into production. And we were just fortunate enough that the announcement with respect to leaving for Ferrari happened, because then the book would have, not had that kind of terminus to know that something new was happening right after this. So that's the reason why. And I think it's an opportune time to kind of think about this portion of his career, then situate ourselves to absorb that and be able to think about what's coming next as well. So,
with all that's been written and said about Lewis in this long and incredibly accomplished career, what made you decide to write a biography to add to that lexicon about Lewis?
So some of this comes from my kind of background, as you mentioned, as a professor who works on cultural studies. So the kind of biographical information is, there are all kinds of people, I think, who are well equipped to kind of handle that. He was here, he was there, this happened, that happened. What I really want to think about in the book is a series of kind of Lewis himself as a cultural phenomenon, and then think about the kind of long-term effects of him as an athlete who's an activist in multiple ways, right? The environment, social justice, diversity, whether it's gender, sexuality, race, et cetera. And also to think about Lewis in the long durée of athletes who have broken boundaries, right? So in that, I'm thinking about Jesse Owens in certain kinds of ways. I'm obviously thinking about Tiger Woods, who changed golf in certain ways. So I think that was in many ways the motivation to take a look at Lewis from a different perspective that I think exceeds the kind of biographical, because then I'm really concerned about, what Lewis thinks he's doing and then the way the world kind of perceives it and what happens kind of surrounding that, right? So if we think about what happened in 2020 when he had protested against police violence, that was part of a larger cultural milieu that I think can get lost if we only focus on what's happening with him in the four corners of kind of Formula One racing.
Tell us about the distinction you see between figures like Lewis and Muhammad Ali and Arthur Ashe and Colin Kaepernick and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, superstar black athletes who spoke out on issues like civil rights, equal opportunity, the environment, and so forth, and others such as Michael Jordan, who chooses not to.
Right. So, yeah, Jordan becomes really important in this conversation, and Tiger Woods in certain ways too, because Tiger has his own ideas about the way he fits into just this kind of genealogy that you proposed. Mm-hmm. I think I would probably most properly compare Lewis to kind of to Muhammad Ali most obviously, mm-hmm. and Jackie Robinson as well, for someone who breaks kind of a barrier, right? A real or imagined type of barrier. And so I think what's different about Lewis, and Ali was an international figure in the same way that Lewis is, right? Because, I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s. So Ali was a constant presence in my life. And, my dad took me to see his fight against Larry Holmes on closed circuit television. I cried for 2 days after that because it was so devastating to me, because for me, Ali was literally a superhero, right? That was, because that was just all I understood about him. And I also understood that he had spoken out on things that people needed to be paying attention to. So I think part of Lewis fits into that conversation. Well, Kareem obviously is in that area, and then obviously what happened with Kaepernick. But I think it's different about Lewis in that milieu, and again, kind of bracketing Ali from the international perspective. In that milieu, there's the fact of the matter that Lewis cares about things that are outside of his own kind of domestic concerns, right? So you have a person who's from a town in England someplace, who's concerned about what's going on in Brazil, who's concerned about what's going on in Kentucky in America, all these kinds of things, where he can very easily, in ways that I think Tiger Woods probably has, cordoned himself off from those kinds of concerns. And there's reason to do that, right? Because being able to pay attention to all those things and be great at your sport and also be able to pay careful attention to these other things is important. I think the difference between Lewis and a person like Colin Kaepernick is that Kaepernick was not at the top of the sport when he started exhibiting his kind of activism. He was doing it from the bench, literally, right? Mm-hmm. He wasn't playing anymore. He had his run to the Super Bowl, and everyone kind of knew that Colin Kaepernick's best years as a quarterback were probably behind him, right? So what Lewis has done is to do this in a sport where obviously Black people had not been present at all, to do it from a perspective of internationalism, and to do it from the top of the sport and seemingly not be concerned about the effect that might have on his commercial success. And I think when you mentioned Michael Jordan, Jordan was always concerned about his commercial success because he did lots of things from an activist perspective, but he did them in ways that people weren't aware that he was up doing them, right? So he obviously had a careful distance between himself and what he was up to just for that reason. I don't think Lewis cares about that. And I think that's a step forward in the way we understand modern athletes and activism.
I'm glad you mentioned Tiger Woods. Anybody who knows anything about Tiger knows how significant his father, Earl, was in Tiger's development. And you mentioned other fathers of superstar Black athletes like the Williams sisters, Richard Williams and so forth. Talk a little bit about the impact of Anthony Hamilton in Lewis's life, including the fact that at the point Lewis decided to make his own decisions about his career, Anthony seemed to be perfectly willing to step away.
Yeah, I think part of the story here, and also this gets to where we started, is the reason to write the book is there's an important story about fatherhood and parenting that is here too, right? And I think it extends beyond. And I think what's interesting about Lewis's relationship, the way I understand it with his dad, is he always wanted it to extend beyond what they were doing in racing, right? And he always wanted to have, he mentions that these moments where you were just my dad and not these other things. So I think there's a point where any parent has to be able to let to let everything that they told their child be what the child does when they can't be around to kind of affect it, right? I think for Lewis, that played itself out in very public fashion because I think, and I make this argument in the book that Anthony comes from a very particular generation of black migrants from the Caribbean, the Windrush is kind of post World War II, who show up in Britain, and he understands a particular way to kind of go about your business, right? There's going to be racism, there's going to be, problems with respect to bigotry, but you do a good job, and therefore things will work out for you, right? I think he has Lewis buys into that for a period of time. He does everything he's supposed to. 2007 has the season that we all know he had in his first year. Then he gets to testing in Barcelona in 2008 and experiences like this kind of the most kinetic kind of racist practices you could possibly see, right? I think the kind of silence on the silent approach to just doing your business, he realized at that point was not going to be good enough for him as an individual. So I think it's not I don't view it as a break with his dad. I think it's an evolution from his dad's position as to how to go about dealing with these kinds of difficult situations. I think over the years, when you get to kind of 2019 and 2020, Lewis really develops a voice. I think has a lot to do with, again, his kind of international presence in places and spaces where, Formula One drivers are very focused people, right? And Lewis finds time to do a lot of other things. I think that contributed to that too. So when his dad walked away, and I'm not, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. I'm not ever sure that Lewis actually ever hired his dad as a manager. He just was his manager, right? And his dad at the same time, right? There was no interviewing process. It didn't seem to be kind of any coherent business agreement because it really wasn't necessary, right? It was just a relationship between a parent and a child. And there had to be some progress from that. And I think it was, and obviously I don't have to think it, it says it was a very difficult time when they had that break, because this is where things kind of played out for them in the world of racing, was where they experienced both the professional relationship and their personal relationship. For that break to happen, I think was significant. But then when you see these kind of most important moments, like last year at Silverstone, or in 2021 in the final race, his dad is always right there, right? So I think that they figured out how to manage that relationship between the two of them. And I think in many ways, Tiger Woods' dad, some of the stories about the way Tiger Woods' dad trained Tiger are difficult to imagine, right? And I mentioned in the book too, right? In entertainment, you see the same thing with Joe Jackson and his sons, right? This kind of complicated relationship. I think that in many ways, Anthony Hamilton exemplifies the best of those ways of managing this, because it can be very complicated and it's probably not going to work, right? It's like, the chances of this coming off the way it did are basically zero, right? And somehow, they catch this talent and the opportunity and all these kinds of things at the same time. And his dad's drive, and I think it paid off in ways that we all benefit from. But I think it's also an example for any parent who has a child that dreams about anything, whether it's playing an instrument or being a really good math teacher. I think it's the same. Much of that is the same, to kind of explore those the lines between parenting and professionalism. I think are important to navigate.
Well, it's time for a break here on Speed City. We'll be back to the interview afterward, but the good news is we've solved our technical problems, and Jonathan Green will join me when we come back. So stick around for more.
I tell you what I want to watch, what I want to talk about, Bob, and there's the stories in the running order, but I don't think I'm sure you looked at that Cadillac story and went, well, yeah, okay, so finally it's good, but over the weekend I've been reflecting on just how big it is now. We can truly say that not only do we have two American teams, we have a third capitalized, Oralton, by an American company, and obviously with Oracle, Red Bull, McLaren run by an American CEO. I just
Right.
feel this is an era that you and I personally have been waiting 30 years for.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'm also curious, and not in a good way, about how TWG, the group that
Yeah.
Don Tauris has put together, who those guys are and what their goal is.
I'm George Russell, and you're listening to Speed City.
Welcome back to the fastest hour in radio, Speed City.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Bob Varsha. This is Speed City. You just heard from George Russell, which is very appropriate because I think he's one of the unspoken drivers when we talk about the new GM entry in Formula One. Yes, we heard about the various drivers who are out of work right now. And we heard about Colton Herta, maybe at the top of the list to join the team. George Russell is out of contract at the end of this year. One of several drivers that I think GM needs to take a look at. But that's all ahead of us right now. We want to finish our interview with Michael Sawyer about his new book, Sir Lewis. Oh, okay. Tell you what, change of plans. This is what happens in live radio and TV, folks. Let's turn instead to Johnny Green himself and hear what he's been up to while sitting on, no doubt, pins and needles, waiting to get on air as we solved our technical issues. Hey, Johnny.
Yeah, sorry, Bob. Yeah, no blushing on your part, my part, all alone. Yeah, and I'll tell you what, it made me realize while waiting that I'm really glad that Casey got that interview out again, because I think there's a lot of people who would really enjoy the whole of that interview, and it is on our YouTube channel. And I think it's a rare insight, an intellectual insight, if you will, into our sport. And I hope there's more deeper dives than that, because racing drivers, albeit they figures of great interest and celebrity, are also really interesting guys. And as you know, people like Lewis Hamilton and many retired racing drivers, are great businessmen. Not all, but a lot of them have become hugely successful because of the disciplines they learn in motor racing. And, Lewis is front and center in that respect, because he could quit tomorrow and he would be a multi-billionaire.
Yes, no question about that. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the beauties of Michael Sawyer's book, Sir Lewis, is that he doesn't denigrate anybody else. It's not like Lewis is the king, everybody else comes up short in so many different ways. He actually gives credit where credit is due to people like Max Verstappen and Fernando Alonso and so on and so forth. So as I say, he also talks about technology and how Formula One got to where it is and what it's all about now. It's really a good read. And again, I highly recommend it. But with that, let's move on to the stories of the day. And I hope you'll agree, Jonathan, the number one story is formal approval for GM to join the ranks of Formula One in 2026.
Yeah, and you know what's funny? I read that story, and I don't know if you were similar. I sort of saw the sort of confirmation that it's done, and I actually skipped opening the story at first, simply because obviously it was a foregone conclusion.
It was going to happen, yeah.
Yeah. But the more I've reflected on it, the more I thought actually of you and me back in the 90s, trying to sell it like as hard as it possibly could be. Formula One, that is, to the American audience. And I think back then our average audience was about 750,000, maybe 800,000. And, we're now double that. And you could tell the sport is growing. But I feel that this Cadillac, more so than Haas, because Haas did it from the beginning, and I don't think anybody really knew much about Haas automation and whether Gene Haas would stick it out. And it was a minnow team, like a Marussia. In fact, it was made up of a lot of the people from Marussia and the teams that died, sadly, along the way. And so I never felt excited and knew that it would take as long as it has for them to really be a factor. But with Cadillac, and with the announcement that it's done, and with the way that it's kind of bungled along with Andretti at first and then TWG, and I saw the promo and thought, wow, Cadillac in Formula One. That is next level for American participation in Formula One.
No question about it. I will say, I mean, teams get involved in Formula One for lots of reasons. Yeah, Red Bull's been successful. They're a marketing company. Haas, that you mentioned, got involved in Formula One because he wanted his computerized machine tool business to work its way into precision industries all around the world. And he's been terribly successful as that. So, you have to think, where are the real racers? Where are the guys who are out there doing this simply because it's Formula One? You think of Ferrari. I would put McLaren in there as well. I'm not denigrating anybody else for their reasons for coming. And certainly Red Bull, Haas, everybody adds to the menu, if you will, in Formula One. But when I read that article that you mentioned about Dan Taurus and him taking over Andretti Global and now forming this TWG group that will own a number of racing assets, and they mentioned the names of his colleagues in that group, the CEO and so on and so on, I didn't recognize any of those names. I didn't see any kudos to their racing backgrounds. I'm just hoping that these are racing people, that they're in it because it's a competitive sport and it's exciting and glamorous and everything else, and not just because it's a billionaire's boy club and they're just trying to make the big killing when it comes to cashing out further on down the road. I hate to admit it, but I'll look forward to more information on that front. I think Dan Taurus himself is a racer, and I hope he's hiring along those lines. But one way or another, hey, it's spectacular. There comes Cadillac. The Yanks are coming. We're looking at Colton Herta. And the question is, who would the other driver be? And I think that leads to some really interesting speculation. We've heard Valtteri Bottas. Well, we've heard Guo
Zhang Yu, yes.
Yes, indeed. We've heard that he might be out there. Bottas is a race winner. He's obviously fast. He's proven. Not so much Guan Yu Zhou. In fact, he's never won anything at this level. But he is a Ferrari guy, and that's going to be important to GM in this first year when they use Ferrari engines and gearboxes and suspensions and everything else that they can. So I went to the list of Formula One drivers and asked the internet how many are out of contract at the end of the year. And there are some interesting names on there, like George Russell, like Yuki Tsunoda, and virtually all of these young rookies that we're going to be seeing this year, including Liam Lawson, Kimi Antonelli. These guys' contracts are up in 2025, and I hope they're casting their net of potential GM drivers widely enough to see if they can attract some of these young talents.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to pick up on the previous point first, which is I agree with you. I mean, from everything, as you know, I'm good friends with Adam Andretti, who obviously has been watching this as part of the Andretti family over the years. And he obviously knows and has been around with Michael Dan Trauers for many years. And he once told me that he felt that Dan Trauers wasn't a sidekick and just the money for Michael, and Michael was the leading force. It was very much Dan who was pushing for Formula One and his desire to get there. So I don't think anybody should be frightened by the fact that Michael has stepped back for all the reasons that we don't get to go into again. And also, obviously, they've got their ambassador in Mario. I think there are some picks. I know that there's an high-end Marussia guy that's gone into the team. I'd like to talk to Dave O'Neill because he'll know most of the guys, who's, of course, a colleague of ours. And so there are some good Formula One bods, but there's not many around at the moment. I think the opportunity will come, given the size of Cadillac and the, the absolute prestige of Cadillac. I think it would be a fantastic company to work for. And on the other side of it, I'm happy for Cadillac and GM because I remember when I moved to America some 12 years, coming to America some 15 years ago, Max Angelelli was just coming out of Formula 3, and I knew Max, Italian racing driver from Formula 3 at Macau. He did
Mad
about
Max, yep.
7, yeah, Mad Max. And I followed his career and kept in touch with him. And he sent me a message saying, I've just become, the head, and, we're putting together a racing Cadillac team, which, of course, has been hugely successful in IMSA. But to the wider world, and you know what I mean, Bob, Cadillac has never been Ford versus Ferrari, etc. So to see Cadillac now, and I don't mean in 2 years, I mean by, let's say, 2030, go head-to-head with Audi, Ford, Mercedes, and Ferrari with their own power plant, will really, really shake up the world of racing and give us a truly, feasibly world champion of competence of the greatest automakers ever in the last 100 years. And I think America has been sorely missed because they are great innovators, the Gurneys, the Chaparrals, everything. I don't need to tell you about American motorsport, and everybody here listening knows all about it. But if I were a fan in the UK or Germany, there's almost a sort of, oh, yes, they do a good job, but they're not, and I think that's going to change. I really do. They're not coming here. They're not going to spend like Haas and kind of think, oh, should we stay? Should we not? They're coming in a bit like Audi, I think, not to make up numbers. And I think that's that to me is very exciting. And I'm really excited to be part of that era. Going to the drivers, I hadn't thought of George Russell. What a great call. Bottas is obvious. I think the obvious choice right now as the runners and racers stand up, if I had to make a bet, I would say Herta and Bottas. And Herta because obviously the original group said they wanted an American driver, and I know that Mario is still keen on that. But I think Cadillac are a company. They're a brand. They're a huge brand. They want to be represented by the best they can. George is everything that Cadillac could want to look like. So too, I would argue, is Kevin Magnussen, for example. Corporate guy, looks good, represents well, polite. Because I feel that Cadillac do have that air of we're the best, we're the highest level of performance and make in America. And so they will want to be represented that way. Now, whether Colton Herta is the right fit, I don't know. Certainly physically in his performance abilities, yes. But I think there is going to be a bit of a corporate touch to what Cadillac do. Not necessarily first year, but certainly as they come into their own.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation from a branding perspective. As you say, Cadillac has not particularly been known. They're not the first name that comes to mind when you think of a performance brand here in America, despite the fact that they have been racing for quite a long time and with success, as you point out. But this is not Cadillac. This is General Motors. That means Chevrolet and, the Corvettes and all they've done. And, Cadillac will race well. Before that, there was Pontiac and Oldsmobile and Buick and on and on and on. General Motors is certainly a member of the Founders Club when it comes to American motorsports. The Cadillac brothers go as far back as Henry Ford. So, yes, it is going to be a big moment when GM arrives waving the stars and stripes. And, the whole driver lineup thing, a lot of that's going to fall on the shoulders of Graham Loudon, who's the ex-Marussia guy that you mentioned. He has come forward. He'll be the team principal. He is now facing the press. He's sort of the point man for the whole project now. And that all seems to be going pretty smoothly. You mentioned Audi. We're hearing discouraging words about Audi taking over, what was once the Sauber team. Things aren't going terribly well there, apparently. But hey, that's the name of the game. We've got to take another break. So let's do that right now and leave ourselves time to the top of the hour. You're listening to Speed City, and we'll be right back.
Good chat. Interesting.
Yeah.
Who else? I mean, I don't think Guan Yu Zhou's in the running. A Chinese driver and an American team doesn't seem to make sense to me.
No.
Not
Ferrari connection. Ferrari connection.
Yes, that's okay. Fair enough. Yep.
And Franco Colapinto's magic sponsorship.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, it's a really interesting time. And the other thing I was going to mention is, you followed supercars over the years, or Australian
Yep.
supercars, and that Ford versus Holden, that blue. I
Oh
think
yeah.
may well see GM create a more. It might actually create a fandom of what I would call the regular American fans of Corvette, of GM. And hey, we're America, and we're going to take on the world. We're going to travel the world. We're going to go to Spa. We're going to, and we're going to wear, just like
Yeah.
the Orange Army. There may well become a situation where Cadillac creates that kind of following. I mean, excuse me.
I'm Liam Lawson, and you're listening to Speed City.
Welcome back to the fastest hour in radio, Speed City.
Welcome back to Speed City. Bob Varsha and Jonathan Green with you on this Sunday in March. We're talking about Formula One, the arrival of GM, which is now formally on the cards. Somebody is going to have to write a monstrous check to get involved under the new tripartite agreement of Formula One teams, FIA, Formula One, and so forth. GM's not going to get into Formula One for the $200 million that was originally put up as the ante, if you will. If you want to play, you got to pay. The number is probably going to be closer to $600 million, but it will be paid, and we'll have someone else to cheer for in Formula One here in the United States. Should we move on, Jonathan? I mentioned at the top of the show that this whole business of David Richards and Motorsports UK suing the president of the FIA. Getting spicy.
And the reason I felt bad on the eve of Australia or the week before Australia, sort of bringing this up because I don't want to start the year on a negative, but I put in the notes, there's so much excitement about this year. I think there's so many unknowns because of the testing didn't really show us too much. Also, the rules haven't changed to the point whereby anything dramatic is going to happen. So we can expect the usual top four, as it were, and the likes of Alpine and Williams knocking on that door, if not getting in. But I still think that creates an excitement that perhaps is great. But every week I read another story about Ben Suleiman, particularly, and the FIA. And I've been, fairly strong about my disdain for. I just feel that Ben Suleiman, who I thought was a good choice at the first, because I was one of the few people that knew who he was, having lived out in Asia. I knew his racing prowess from rally, and I could see how, having seen having seen this sort of French domination of the FIA, because obviously it's based there. It was a kind of a real kind of breath of fresh air to see somebody from the Middle East, knowing that the Middle East would be and is a huge part of Formula One, and now is, made sense to me. And I thought, oh, that's a good idea. Nobody really knows his racing acumen. He's got, he could be, a Sebastian Loeb from the Middle East in terms of how the drivers perceive him. He's been there, done that. But unfortunately, to me, I think he's been very ineffective as a leader. And I think somewhat, if I'm putting my finger on it, kind of a little bit old-fashioned in his approach to how he's treating the drivers like schoolboys and fining them for swearing, and also sort of, grabbing power here and making sure that, that he's not criticized. And I just don't think it's healthy. And I just don't want to see 25 dissolve and devolve into a lot of these stories that we're now seeing. David Richards, the next one. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would. I read David Richards' letter that he sent out to explain why they were considering legal action. And we should also say all this takes place against the backdrop of 2025, when Ben Sulayem is up for re-election as president of the FIA. So that's a whole nother tangent to this story. But Dave Richards said, look, the guy made all these promises about what he was going to do. He hasn't done any of them. He promised, that he would be transparent. The drivers have their own argument that he has not been transparent. He operates in some secrecy. The reason that Dave Richards wrote the letter was because he was barred from the most recent meeting of the World Motorsport Council, the top level.
He wouldn't sign an NDA.
Because he wouldn't sign a non-disclosure agreement not to talk about whatever they talked about in the meeting, which, struck everybody as being really weird. So he didn't sign it. He didn't get into the meeting. And now, people are butting heads. But this is the FIA, the Federación Internacional del Automóvil. This covers everything having to do with motoring worldwide, touring, road building, safety on the highways, all this kind of stuff. And yet, Mohammed bin Sulayem seems to spend all of his time in front of cameras talking about Formula One. I don't know where the rest of the business of the motoring world gets done, but either that or Ben Sulayem never goes to sleep, one or the other.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. And like you say, he's up for a vote, and I've got a feeling that, I don't know, that he may get the push, personally. I think so. And I do think some wiser rules need to, we cannot go on. We are potentially going to lose one of the greatest drivers we've ever had out of petulance, out of sort of, I just don't want to play anymore type thing.
Right.
And I'm talking about obviously Max Verstappen, who is on 8 points coming into this season for a start, of the 12 that would, agree a ban. And to see someone like Max get a ban, it happened to Magnussen, but he wasn't vying for a world title. And whether we like it or not, Red Bull aren't that bad to the point where they're going to be out of at least chasing the constructors title. So if Max does get penalized and continues to be sought after, and to be fair, he gets penalized when he does wrong. I get that. And it's not just his words. There's also his actions on track that have got him penalties as well. But I just feel that a governing body should be in the background to litigate things that go wrong, not starting to get into, you swore, so we're gonna do this.
Right. Yeah. It's like, we complain about it all the time. You don't want the rules to be deciding the races or the official calls and so forth. Nobody goes to the games to watch the coaches coach or to watch the referees call the plays. No, you go there to watch spectacular athletes do death-defying things in cars that are absolutely terrifying. And we need to keep in mind as well, Formula One is facing a reckoning, I would say in the next 4 or 5 years, we are bound to see the retirements of Lewis Hamilton, of Fernando Alonso, perhaps of Max Verstappen, and no sport can survive without having its heroes and having them on the grid. So they need to be nurturing more excitement, more opportunities, more competition.
Yeah, and who's kidding who? Especially as something as ridiculous as the swearing. There are other decisions we could go into, and there's plenty. But the swearing one really gets my goat because, anybody who watches professional sport at any level, whether it be NFL football, whether it be tennis, whether it be skiing, whatever it might be, like you said, these are people under pressure doing something that is exceedingly hard and life threatening. Emotions run high. That is part of the sport. And I don't want to say I want to encourage it, but it's a little old-fashioned to think that the audience can't put up with that. And then put these egregious fines that only Formula One drivers could pay makes kind of a bit of a joke of it. It becomes like, we'll fine you 500,000. And, Formula One, 100 million for Ron Dennis. It's silly money. And while some of that is acceptable when people cheat, in the case of Ron Dennis or the case of McLaren, being caught out that way. Not that it was Ron Dennis's fault, I may add. But I just find it a little, and also the Singapore situation with Piquet. Those are things that need to be knocked out of the sport by the FIA. But swearing, really? That's like saying, he didn't put his socks up, or, that woman had her hair down too long and needs to be put up in a ponytail because the sport doesn't want that. It's just, that's silly.
I was there in 1989 when Senna and Prost had their celebrated collision in Japan. The title went to Prost. Senna gave an angry rant during an interview about how it was because Prost was French and the head of the FIA then, a Frenchman named Jean-Marie Balest, was favoring Prost for the world championship, and he used very colorful language. And Balest used that language to rescind Ayrton Senna's racing license. And I was in the room the following race, which was Australia, here in Adelaide. And Senna, I guess someone had, when he cooled down, he realized he was in big trouble, because if he'd had a license, he wasn't going to drive. But he spoke to a packed room of reporters about how, look, I mean, I was angry. I had every reason to be angry. English is not my first language. I used every tool in my toolbox to try to convey in words how angry I was about to what appeared to him to be the unfairness of this whole situation. Now that I think about it, it's a bit like Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen in 2021.
Yeah.
But yeah, he said, look, this is language I've heard all the English speakers around me use all the time, especially in the garage. And, should I suffer like this just for the use of this language that was not my first one to begin with? And, everybody agreed with him, because everybody hated Balest anyway. So
Bob,
he wrote an apology and got his license back, and the rest is history.
Bob, we're running out of time, so I want to finish on two good things.
Okay.
I want your take on Australia and the form guide, because as I said earlier, I don't think we know too much yet. And I also want you to join me in wishing a good friend to both of us. And I know this because I went to Bob's office when he was a big man at Fox, and I sat in his office doing some work on a MotoGP while he was away at Le Mans. And there I saw a picture of Uncle Brian Redman, who celebrates his 88th birthday today. Brian Redman. Happy birthday.
Absolutely. Happiest of birthdays to Brian Redman, one of the great personalities and stories in worldwide motorsport. Terrific guy.
Still out there too. He's going to an event next week. He's got several, Targa 66 and many others. Chattanooga he's part of. He keeps on rolling. Good old Brian. What are your thoughts, as we finish off today, about Australia? What's your bet, if you will?
I think we have no idea what it's going to be like in Australia. Now, we came from from testing. And as I always say, you don't learn much from testing, because, everybody's got a different agenda and they're doing different things. Some teams are out there to try to attract sponsor money, not as much now as they did, 20, 30 years ago. But, they may put sticky tires and low fuel and go like hell to set a lap time and try and attract some money for the season to come. I don't think we see that much of that anymore, but the tires are going to change slightly. The cars, not so much. And there's always the shadow of sandbagging. Who doesn't want people to know what they can really do? So we'll go into Australia with a lot of questions to answer. I expect, as Martin Brundle was recently quoted saying, Red Bull doesn't look great. The car doesn't look great. The drivers aren't happy with it. That's usually a pretty genuine indication that, that they're headed for a rough weekend in Australia. And keep in mind, that's the first of a double header. Right after Australia, they go off to China. I was delighted, with Williams doing so well in testing. I hope they're right up there. I wish the best for Lewis Hamilton and the remade Ferrari team as they go out there. Certainly for McLaren, and all of its American influences, as you pointed out, and two great guys and deserving champions doing the driving, and on and on and on. There's so much to look forward to that Melbourne is definitely going to be appointment television. And apologize to all our listeners out there. We had some problems today. We didn't get you the full hour. We'll try to do better next week.
Yes, we will. And I'll take full responsibility for that technical glitch. And I couldn't agree more. And here's a food for thought. You mentioned George Russell. What if Mercedes are just as good, if not better than Red Bull, as you mentioned, and can, over the season, outperform both the Ferrari drivers, with George Russell finally leading the team and out-qualifying Lewis last year 10-2? Could be the world champion approaching Cadillac. How about that for a thought? I'll leave it with you, Bob.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we've talked about it before. The beginning of this season is more important than any season before it, because teams have to decide what they're going to do about next year's very different car they need to devote their resources to. But with that in mind, we'll bid you all a great weekend and a great week. We'll look forward to seeing you next week as we all warm up for the start of the 2025 Formula One season. So long, everyone.
Can't wait.